Welcome to Australian Parliament House. My name is Andrew Banfield. I'm the Assistant Secretary, Research Branch in the Parliamentary Library. It gives me great pleasure to be hosting the International Day of Democracy Talk, co-hosted with the Parliamentary Library and the Parliamentary Engagement Branch. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay our respects to elders, past and present. In 2007, the UN General Assembly resolved to observe September the 15th, which this year is a Sunday, as the International Day of Democracy. Its purpose is to promote and uphold principles of democracy and invited all member states to commemorate the day in an appropriate manner. To that end, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Kerryn Baker from the Australian National University's Cora Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Her talk today is entitled Australia and Democracy in the Pacific Islands. She'll speak for about a half hour or so, and then there'll be an opportunity for Q&A at the conclusion. Dr. Baker.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for coming. It's great to be here. My name is Kerryn Baker. I am a fellow looking at Pacific politics at the Australian National University. I want to start the talk at the end of 2019. Cast your minds back. We didn't really know what COVID was. It was a glorious time. And Bougainville was holding a referendum on the issue of independence. This was, for me, a real festival of democracy. Voting in communities was accompanied by these celebrations. There was a lot of effort, a lot of money that went into streamlining the electoral administration for the process, but the smooth running of the referendum as an electoral event was really in large part due to the extraordinary level of community buy-in and the commitment of voters to ensuring it was a success. The referendum was more than a simple electoral process. It was this long-awaited community celebration, and it was really recognised as such in communities all across the region. Gordon Peake described the referendum period as a time of civic joy, and that was certainly my experience as an observer during the referendum. I spent 3 weeks there observing polling across the region, as well as the counting process in Booker. And I want to show you just a couple of videos from my time in Bougainville, just to kind of capture the feeling of the referendum process. So, sorry. So, this is at the opening of polling on the first day in Booker. So on that first day, then President of Bougainville, John Momis, led this march to Balisi Park in the middle of Booker, where all these people were gathered. As he cast the first vote of the referendum, there was singing, there was dancing, there were Bougainvillean flags in abundance. It was a real celebratory scene. And then 2 days later, I was at the opening of polling in a village in North Bougainville, where two members of the House of Representatives, so the local constituency member and the North Women's representative, gave speeches about the significance of the referendum for themselves personally and for their community. Before there was more singing, there was celebration, there was this great performance by a bamboo band that I'm going to show you. And then further south, I observed in a village where there was this formal procession and a series of cultural performances that were organised to welcome the polling officials and the ballot box into the community. So I wanted to... I wanted to show you these videos to just kind of emphasise that this vote was not just a vote. It was this expression of Bougainvillean pride. It was a responsibility taken on behalf of past and future generations to participate in the process. And yeah, it was the expression of civic joy. The Bougainville referendum was pretty unique as an electoral event. But in observing elections across the Pacific, in Bougainville, in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands and Samoa, across 7 elections over the last 10 years, voting can often be this expression of civic joy. There's a clear and strong commitment to democracy in the region that manifests in the way normal life seems to get put on pause during the election. The election is the event. On polling day, the longest lines are generally first thing in the morning because people are so eager to be among the first to cast their votes. People often line up for hours and hours for the opportunity to participate without complaint. In my experience, elections have not always gone smoothly, I should mention, and I've also seen on occasion angry crowds when polling has been delayed or even cancelled. Yet this too is a sign of political engagement. Even when frustrations boil over, it's a demonstration of how much people care about demonstrating their democratic rights. Even with this underlying commitment to the democratic process, political participation can be challenging in the region. Electoral administration can be very difficult, often taking place in extremely geographically complex contexts with highly dispersed populations. This makes for elections with some of the highest per capita costs in the world, particularly in Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. In smaller political units, politics is intensely personalised, with often direct relationships between voters and politicians that can complicate the process of making claims on the state. Smallness can help foster a democratic culture in making politics more accessible to the average voter, but it can also subvert democracy through the creation of patronage and clientelist networks that can bypass the state. Politics across the region is dominated by older male voices, with the region as a whole having the lowest levels of women's parliamentary representation of any region in the world. Parties tend to be quite weakly institutionalised, which also reinforces this atomised nature of politics in much of the region. Using data from the ANU Department of Pacific Affairs large-scale election observation projects across the region, which I've been really fortunate to be a part of, we can see how these dynamics play out in election processes and the diversity of Pacific political context. The 2016 Samoan and 2019 Solomon Islands election reports, for example, detail largely peaceful, free and fair elections in challenging political and geographic contexts, with key issues raised being gender differences in participation, some practices of vote buying, political gifting and so-called money politics, and in the case of Solomon Islands, cross-border registration or the large-scale movement of registered voters between constituencies. On the extreme end, the 2017 Papua New Guinea election report highlights the widespread deterioration of the electoral environment. It quotes one observer in the Highlands region saying, only the strong, middle-aged and young men managed to vote. Old people didn't vote, sick people didn't vote, disabled people didn't vote, pregnant women didn't vote, young girls didn't vote, and women didn't vote. Yet despite these challenges, what's perhaps remarkable is the resilience of democratic political cultures across the region. The region as a whole has a solid track record of regularly scheduled elections and peaceful transfers of power, with very few exceptions. Further than that, there is a clear popular commitment to democracy in both principle and in practice right across the region. Using representative popular attitudes data from the Pacific Attitude Survey conducted over the last few years in Samoa and Vanuatu, we can see that most people, 61% in Samoa, 76% in Vanuatu, believe democracy is preferable to any other kind of government. This is compared to a small minority, 17% in Vanuatu and 8% in Samoa, who agreed that under some circumstances, an authoritarian government can be preferable to a democratic one. We can also see a really high level of trust in political institutions across both Samoa and Vanuatu, especially when this data is compared to the latest Australian Barometer study findings. For example, 83% of respondents in Vanuatu and 68% in Samoa expressed high levels of trust in Parliament, compared to 36% of Australians. These findings are especially significant given the context in which the Samoa and Vanuatu surveys were carried out. In Samoa, the data collection was in late 2020 and early 2021, in the lead up to the very contested 2021 election, which resulted in a protracted constitutional crisis, and in a context where fierce debates were taking place over changes to the Land and Titles Court that were framed as a challenge to judicial authority. So it was a very tense time in Samoan politics. In Vanuatu, the data collection was in late 2023, over a period in which 2 successful votes of no confidence took place. So this meant that there were actually 3 different prime ministers in the period in which we were asking about levels of trust in the institution of the prime minister. 82% in Vanuatu and 64% in Samoa, compared to 48% in Australia, again in the most recent Australian Barometer study. So despite these contexts of quite intense political turbulence and instability, underlying faith in political institutions remains intact, and that's a really important thing. The vibrancy of democratic culture can be seen in the civic joy of elections and in the resilient public commitment to democracy and faith in institutions. This vibrancy of democratic culture is a core asset in Pacific politics, but it's undermined by a tangible disconnect between citizens and political life. Again, findings from the Pacific Attitude Survey illuminate this. A majority, so 63% in Samoa and 85% in Vanuatu, agreed with the statement that politics seem so complicated that a person like me can't really understand what's going on, and this is a problem. While voters may often have a personal connection to their local MP, national politics and political decision-making can feel very distant. The role of an MP is often framed in terms of community-level work rather than national legislative responsibilities. Findings from the Vanuatu Pacific Attitude Survey highlight this. When respondents were asked what their MPs currently focus on the most, promote national development was the most common answer, but when they were asked what they should focus on the most, help with community projects was the most common answer. We see here pressures that are exerted on politicians to prioritise local projects over national policy making. This is exacerbated in countries of the Western Pacific, which have large-scale constituency development funding models, so significant proportions of their government budgets, which are allocated directly to MPs for discretionary spending in their constituencies. In these contexts, the role of an MP increasingly becomes closer to that of a project manager than a legislator. In such countries, we can also see a trend towards fewer parliamentary sitting days, meaning MPs can spend more time on core project work in their constituencies, which is key to getting them re-elected, but it reduces the ability of Parliament to pass and debate laws. Exacerbating such dynamics is a disconnect between the selection of a candidate at the ballot box and the formation of government. In countries without strong party systems, voter choice is heavily individualised, and elected MPs often have a lot of leeway to shift political allegiance within parliamentary coalitions without risk of electoral backlash. So we see candidates primarily elected on individual characteristics rather than policy, and consequently, the formation of loose and fragile political coalitions and frequent changes of government. There have been efforts to implement party strengthening laws in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and most recently Vanuatu to mitigate this, although how much such procedural changes can shift underlying political culture factors is up for debate. But fundamentally, the widespread absence of strong party systems across the region raises an important issue. If voters do not see a clear link between their choice of MP and how governments are formed, it can exacerbate this disengagement. One metric for measuring this is voter turnout. So most Pacific countries don't have compulsory voting systems, and this means we can use turnout as a broad measure of political engagement. As you can see here, the story is very complicated. The available official voter turnout figures in most recent elections vary significantly, from 44% in the 2022 Vanuatu election to 85% in the 2024 Kiribati elections first round, where voting is not compulsory, and 96% in the 2022 Nauru elections, where voting is compulsory. This suggests there is some cause for concern on political engagement, although, as with most political indicators, the Pacific Islands resist simple generalisations. The persistence of democratic cultures may also be threatened by the undermining of institutions in parts of the region. International IDEA's latest Global State of Democracy report warned of potential increasing external pressures on democratic institutions in the Pacific. The Amnesty International State of the World's Human Rights Report, published in April this year, raised various concerns in terms of political rights in the Pacific, notably restrictive laws on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly in Fiji, and proposed measures that would restrict freedom of the press in Papua New Guinea. Recently, the expulsion of the Chief Justice in Kiribati and his replacement in the role by the Attorney General raised concerns over separation of powers and the independence of the judiciary. Concerns were also raised in Solomon Islands when the most recent election, scheduled for 2023, was postponed by a year. In 2021 and 2022, contested transfers of power following elections in Samoa and Fiji raised concerns about the integrity of democratic institutions. In Samoa in May 2021, FAST Party leader Fiame Naomi Mataafa and her fellow party members gathered in Apia after the Supreme Court had ordered Parliament should sit to swear in a new government following the April election. Finding the Parliament building locked, and with the caretaker speaker unwilling to hand over the key, and knowing that any further delays would risk voiding the election results, Fiame and her supporters decided to hold their own impromptu swearing-in ceremony in a marquee that was hastily assembled on the parliamentary grounds, which you can see here. The symbolism was clear. Fiame, who would be Samoa's first woman Prime Minister, was literally and figuratively locked out of Parliament. But there was also another layer of symbolism here. The marquee stood very close to where Samoa's first parliament, the Whalefono, was once situated, built in the open-air traditional style, so it wasn't enclosed. Anyone could come in and see politics being practiced. While the Whalefono had been replaced by a modern enclosed building in the 1970s, which had in turn been replaced by a newer, more modern building in 2019, the marquee swearing-in could be seen as a return to a more open and public style of politics, messy though the circumstances might have been. In Samoa, as in Fiji the following year, democratic institutions ultimately prevailed and peaceful transfers of power occurred. So far in 2024, we've seen parliamentary elections carried out in Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, and in Kiribati, as well as Vanuatu's first ever national referendum process. All this points to democracy's resilience in the Pacific region. So what is Australia's role in supporting democracy in the Pacific? Australia routinely asserts the importance of democracy to Australia's foreign policy, including in the Pacific. This is closely aligned with Pacific regional priorities. The Pacific Islands Forum 2050 strategy for a Blue Pacific continent includes as a core value good governance, the full observation of democratic principles and values, the rule of law, the defence and promotion of all human rights, gender equality, and a commitment to just societies. Historically, Australia has been an important supporter of democracy in the Pacific through its bilateral and regional programs. This has included explicit forms of democracy support targeted at formal democratic institutions, so supporting elections and parliaments. Over time, Australian support expanded to focus on the broader objective of good political governance. Currently, a substantial proportion of Australia's official development assistance, much of which is directed towards the Pacific region. This includes an approach to institutional engagement that goes beyond elections and parliaments to include a broader range of democratic stakeholders such as accountability agencies, the judiciary, security forces and the media. In November 2023, the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade issued its report on the inquiry into supporting democracy in our region. The report produced 8 key recommendations, including on funding and producing public policy on electoral assistance, increased support for measures to combat climate change and its potential impacts on democracy and democratic institutions, supporting women in parliament programming, and increasing a focus on media and civil society channels for supporting democracy. It is this focus on media and civil society, as well as other forums that facilitate political discussion and debate, that I want to focus on today, because I think this broader ecosystem of democratic institutions is a vitally important but consistently underfunded and undervalued element of democracy support. Supporting democracy is in Australia's interests in the Pacific because it provides the best basis for peaceful and inclusive politics supportive of the developmental interests of the region. As I've tried to make the case for here, it also aligns with Pacific interests, the stated interests of Pacific governments and regional institutions, and the overwhelmingly pro-democracy attitudes of the people of the Pacific. For the potential of Pacific democracy to be fully realised, however, there is scope to build on the type of democratic support provided to countries in the region. Technical support for strengthening institutions is very important, and this is especially true in cases where institutions are under increasing pressure and where there are significant logistical and financial constraints on the effective operation of democratic institutions. Technical support is also relatively, albeit not completely, immune from political sensitivities in providing democracy support. Yet how to support democracy is fundamentally a political question, one that requires political ways of thinking and acting. How can the potential of Pacific democracy be supported more effectively? A key element of democracy support should be providing space for democratic experimentation. This has historically been a key strength in the Pacific. The region has long been a site of generation of creative solutions in politics and elections, with an immense variety of sovereignty arrangements, electoral systems, and constitutional reform processes. This willingness to experiment and to actively translate and transform global democratic norms to suit local contexts can be credited, at least partly, with the resilience of democratic institutions in the region. The Samoan philosopher Asafo So'o has written extensively on the compromise of blending democratic and customary governance elements in the institutions of the Samoan state, and described how as custom has continued to evolve over time in Samoa, so too has a distinctive Samoan form of modern democracy. In the contemporary Pacific, however, it can be argued that the space for democratic contestation and the exchange of ideas is narrowing. There are limited forums for open discussion of politics and policy. Think tanks are few and far between. While there is a rising number of national universities, and this is a really positive development, political studies is an underserved field with very few political science departments, and most academics working in the region have extremely high and burdensome teaching and administrative workloads. The media sector is chronically under-resourced, and economic pressures from the COVID-19 pandemic have further affected the media landscape, while media freedom remains a concern in some parts of the region. In any country, this ecosystem of political debate is critically important for the health of democracy and for the quality of public policy. I don't want to be overly pessimistic, and there are some really great examples of where policy debate and political discussion is being facilitated. One such example is the Press Club in Vanuatu, which is a political panel discussion show that's broadcast on VBTC, and importantly for Pacific audiences, it is also streamed on Facebook. These forums are important, not just for generating political discussion, but for increasing voter and citizen awareness and for diversifying political information. They can be important mechanisms to counter disinformation and misinformation in Pacific societies. And in the absence of a representative cohort of women, youth, ethnic minorities, and people with disability within Pacific parliaments, these forums are also an opportunity to amplify the voices of politically marginalised societal groups. The Pacific could benefit from many more such forums. So where are they? The critical elements for a thriving space for democratic contestation and the exchange of ideas are funding and freedom of expression. It's important to note these are fundamental questions for many countries, not just the Pacific. The Pacific is not the only part of the world where spaces for democratic expression are potentially narrowing. But in the region, there's a pressing need for flexible and independently administered funding, ideally from a range of sources, although that is difficult in the region, to create diverse and dispersed sites for political debate. This is, of course, a lot more politically sensitive than technical support for elections and parliaments, but it's equally important for supporting democracy in the region. Creating these spaces is really vital in context where the opportunities for political voice are quite limited, and consequently, the political engagement of citizens is under threat, even when you do have that strong commitment to democratic norms that underpin societies. The most compelling argument for democracy support to me is that the widespread commitment to democratic values and the vibrant democratic cultures alive within the Pacific. This is often not valued as much as it should be. As esteemed Pacific scholars Teresia Tewa and Malakai Koloa-Matangi have written, it's easy to overlook the valiant and persistent willingness among Pacific peoples to work for democracy. The resilience of democratic norms is readily apparent. But for many citizens of the Pacific, the opportunities for democratic expression are not always there. Democratic cultures in the Pacific cannot be taken for granted and need to be protected and fostered through the creation of more accessible and participatory spaces for political dialogue. That's all I have. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has them.
Could you expand a bit more on the role of women in politics?
Absolutely. So in the Pacific, the level of women's parliamentary representation in independent states is around 7%, and that's compared to a global average that currently sits around 27%. So there's a real substantial gap there in terms of women's access to these formal parliamentary spaces. But that doesn't mean that women aren't actively engaged in politics at various levels and through various means. But it does mean there's obvious institutional barriers in terms of reaching those highest levels of political office. I've been working on gender and politics in the Pacific region for about 10 years, and the confronting thing is it doesn't really seem to be improving in a linear fashion. It's kind of one step forward, two steps back in a lot of cases. In the region this year, for example, the first national election held was in Tuvalu, where women's representation dropped. There was one woman in the previous parliament, and now there's zero, so no women are represented at all. Then we had the election in April in Solomon Islands, where three women were elected, which is great, but there were 4 women in the previous parliament, so that is a decline in terms of numbers. And then in August, we had the Kerryn election, where we saw an increase in women's participation, so 5 women were elected for the first time, which is great, but again, a parliament of 45. So just over 10% representation, still far below that global average. So we do see these kind of these complicated pictures emerging, but overall really low levels of women's representation, and that's why I would argue that these spaces within the media, civil society, think tanks, academic institutions are so important in increasing the ability for women to progress political ideas, to engage in public policy debate, because the opportunities in national parliaments just aren't there necessarily.
Can you touch on whether the Chinese influence and money is a factor in democracies that having a hard time, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. I think, as I mentioned in the speech, it's very difficult to focus on the Pacific region as a political scientist because it really resists kind of clear explanations and clear trends across the region. It might be a factor. We can see in the case of Fiji, for example, after the 2006 coup, there were really strong lines drawn by the Australian and New Zealand governments around progressing a return to democracy as soon as possible. With that, Fiji then focused on really fostering and growing its relationship with China, because those kind of those political conditions weren't necessarily attached when they were talking about development aid and diplomatic engagement. So potentially yes, but then you can see in a lot of cases that I talked about around complicated democratic transitions and pressure in institutions, it's not necessarily that countries recognise China. Like, there's a lot of countries in the region that have in the past or continue to still recognise Taiwan, and these pressures on democratic institutions are still there. So possibly, but it's not kind of a clear story to tell.
Well, I personally feel very uncomfortable about it.
Can I go back, if you don't mind, to the women's issue? The stats you showed, did you also look at gender differentiation in those subjects?
In the attitude survey? Yeah, absolutely. So, sorry, I'll just go back. In this, for example, there were really strong gender differences, and we could see it also in terms of the question, how interested would you say you are in politics? Overall, across these indicators, women are saying they understand politics, are saying they're interested in politics at far lower rates than men. And there's also a generational gap as well. Older people are more interested in politics, think they have a better understanding of politics than younger people. So certainly there are really significant democratic differences, and there's a really clear gender gap in political participation that echoes that gender gap in political representation. These aren't comprehensive region-wide surveys. I would love to do a Pacific attitude survey in every single Pacific country. That's the dream. But at the moment, we only have data for Samoa and Vanuatu. But still, Samoa and Vanuatu are very different contexts with a lot of different drivers for political culture. And in both, you can see this gender gap in political participation. Yeah, I absolutely do. I think it's a lot of it is different contexts as well. There aren't necessarily the kind of partisan differences in Vanuatu, for example, that you'd find in Australian responses to these questions. And you're also, like, it's a very different context, say, in Samoa, like when we were asking these questions on how much trust do you have in the institution of Prime Minister. Well, this was in early 2021. There had been a Prime Minister in Samoa, Tuilepa Sailele Malielegaoi, who had been in power since 1998. So the survey was open to respondents above voting age, so above 21 in Samoa. The youngest respondents to the survey would have never known a time where the Prime Minister wasn't the same person. So in that context, this question is very individualised, right? It's very tied up in the identity of one person, whereas in Vanuatu, the context is very different, and then Australia, different again. So you've got to recognise those changes, but overall, if you take all of these institutional ratings together, you do see a really high level of trust and faith in institutions in the Pacific that's not necessarily there in Australia, and certainly I think there can be lessons drawn from that.
To be fair, they don't suffer the Murdoch media.
But I mean, they don't have a huge amount of media at all. The constraints on media expression are really limited sometimes by governments, but often by just financial realities of the media sector. And that's a really significant issue in a lot of the Pacific.
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. It's been really interesting. You mentioned earlier that there was thought that the only people who can vote really are young men or middle-aged men, not the sick, the elderly, women and girls. What's the strategies that they're looking at to try and overcome that, or are they interested in overcoming that?
Yeah, so this is a quote from the 2017 ANU election report on the Papua New Guinea election. It's from an observer in the Highlands region, in a particular area of the Highlands where voting was very controlled. And so people outside of those political networks didn't necessarily have an opportunity to even access the polling station, let alone cast their vote. That wasn't true across the whole country. Papua New Guinea is, as you might know, the most ethno-linguistically diverse country in the world, and there's a lot of different political regimes and contexts there, some of which are relatively accessible and some of which are very much not. So it definitely doesn't apply to the whole country, but certainly there is an issue with access to civil rights for women and other marginalised groups in parts of Papua New Guinea. One measure that has been introduced to try and counter this is gender segregated polling. So the idea is that at a polling station, it's set up in a way so that women have a separate line, they have a separate voting compartment, and you can kind of set up the polling stations so that women are free from interference and intimidation when they're casting their votes. The actual implementation of my colleagues at the ANU have great maps of the 2022 election and how gender segregated polling was implemented or not across various parts of the country. And it shows a really mixed experience, some where the electoral laws around gender segregated polling are really closely adhered to and others where they're not. But I think it also kind of is a technical solution to a problem of political culture where voter rights are not considered to be individual. Voters do have a lot of pressure exerted upon them to vote in the way that their head of family or head of community would like them to vote. So you can set up gender segregated polling perfectly, but if intimidation has happened before voters get to the polling place, or indeed if the polling place isn't really set up at all because of political economy factors in that particular part of the country, then you need to go further back in terms of how to protect those voting rights and how to encourage people to claim those voting rights for themselves. It's a really complicated problem, and I don't have a particularly good answer for it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, it's also a bit of an opportunity. There is some research that shows where there is kind of significant out-migration, even temporary migration, particularly from men and communities, that open space for women to access decision-making positions that they might not necessarily have had before. But it is an issue. When we were doing this survey in Vanuatu, actually the sample was a really significant issue for us in some parts of the country because our enumerators would go to an area and they couldn't find any men between the ages of 18 and 50 because so many of them were overseas on work. So it's not a universal experience in Vanuatu, but it is, there are significant political dynamics that come from that kind of scale of out-migration, even on a temporary basis. But I would say the rise of seasonal labour mobility programs is a new chapter of a longer story, which is that, even before European expansion into the Pacific, it was a region of extraordinary migration. There was a lot of travel, a lot of voyaging, a lot of exchange between the peoples of the Pacific, and that continues today. You can see these transnational communities that might reside in other Pacific countries or outside of the Pacific, but still retain really close connections to their home communities and their home countries. So I would say it has an impact, but it's probably exaggerated because it's not a new phenomenon in the region. It's a really good question, and the answer is it depends. So some Pacific countries don't have any measures for out-of-country or even out-of-constituency voting. In Solomon Islands, for example, you've got to go back to the polling place where you're registered to cast your vote. You can't cast it even in another part of Solomon Islands, let alone overseas. But there are other countries which try and facilitate voting, particularly for communities that are overseas on a temporary basis. In the Vanuatu referendum, for example, they had polling places in Australia and areas where there are a lot of seasonal workers in New Caledonia and New Zealand. So there are, different countries have different solutions. It is a really significant issue in countries that have a large proportion of their population living overseas at any given time. So in the Marshall Islands, for example, about a third of Marshallese live in the US rather than in the Marshall Islands, and the postal ballots actually have a quite significant impact on elections there. There was an attempt in 2016 to stop postal ballots with the argument that it gives more political rights to people who are actually in country, but that was overturned, and so they have the postal ballot system again. More recently, there's been a lot of debate in Samoa over facilitating the right of Samoans living overseas to cast their votes in elections. Again, it's a controversial issue, and different countries have different ways of dealing with it, but it's certainly on the agenda in a lot of Pacific states.
You raised the issue of media. TVNZ and Radio New Zealand play an important role in the Pacific. The ABC used to with Radio Australia. Do you think the Australian government is failing in actually solving some of those issues?
I think there was a step back in terms of providing media support that had an impact at least on Australia's soft power, like having a network that allows access to Australian media in the region is actually a really easy way of building that soft power up. So I think that is a missed or a lost opportunity there. But I think for me, the really critical element of this is forging connections between Australian media institutions and local media, so that those local media ecosystems can grow and gather in strength. And the ABC is doing a lot of work in this area, and there could be more support. The inquiry for supporting democracy in the region specifically highlighted that. And yeah, I think it's really important. Like, Australian media reach in the region is really important, but enabling these media sectors to grow, so that you have a diversity of viewpoints and a vibrant sites for political debate are really important, and that's where the most impact can be had, I think.
Thank you for this, it's fantastic. I'd like to ask you, I guess, for your thoughts or reflections on 5 years later, after Bougainville's referendum, and some clear expressions of frustration from the ABG and Bougainvilleans more broadly with regards to engagement from the national government of Papua New Guinea, and then, I guess, the spectre that it raises with various statements from New Ireland and New Britain and the possibility of further claims for independence.
Yeah, it's a complicated story, and there hasn't been a huge amount of progress towards a resolution in the 5 years since the referendum took place. It's not the only part of the Pacific where you have these kind of uncertain ends to referendum processes, and a lot of dialogue still needing to be had. The recent events in New Caledonia highlight this really well. I think for me, what I would point to is, again, that that idea of democratic experimentation. There's a lot of space between being incorporated into a state, being a territory, and being a fully independent nation. And there are a lot of examples across the Pacific of quite diverse and creative answers to the question of sovereignty that could be explored, I think, in a lot of these contexts. Whether there's the political will to explore those, particularly, in a context like Bougainville, where the vote on independence was so clear, is another more political issue that I won't comment on. But I do think there is, this really strong and impressive history in the Pacific of finding interesting answers to these really complicated political questions. And I think there's scope for more exploration there in the context of these quite seemingly intractable debates on self-determination in parts of the region.
Any final questions for Dr. Baker? In that case, join me in thanking her for a really wonderful talk. And that brings our time together to a conclusion. Go well.